All right. I'm Eric Schwitzgebel. I'm a philosophy professor at University of California, Riverside, and I'm interested in connections between philosophy and empirical psychology, especially belief and the relationship between moral reflection and moral behavior.
I'm Tamar Gendler. I'm a professor of philosophy at Yale University, and like Eric, I'm interested in empirical psychology, its implications for philosophical questions such as the nature of belief, the relation of belief to other attitudes, and the relation of all of that to moral reflection and moral behavior.
Hey, so we're interested in the same stuff.
That's
But we
so
knew that
exciting.
already.
So nice to be doing it on Philosophy TV.
Yeah. So I'm excited about this new enterprise. We'll see how it goes. So,
Terrific.
so what we want to talk about today is implicit associations and their relationship to attitudes like belief. Tamar, do you want to start off by talking about some of the empirical research on that?
One of the interesting bodies of empirical research that's been going on for the last couple of decades has concerned implicit associations that people have with various social categories. And some of the most striking work in this domain has been done with respect to racial categories. And one of the standard measures that has been used to determine this is a task designed by Mazarin Banaji, who was at Yale and is now at Harvard, that involves measuring the differences in people's reaction times when they're asked to pair together racial terms like black with positive notions and racial terms like black with negative notions, and contrasting that with the speed with which they associate racial terms like white and positive notions and racial terms like white and negative notions.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that over a large body of studies, it looks like the majority of Americans raised in 20th century American culture find it easier to associate positive terms with whites and negative terms with blacks than vice versa. And the same phenomenon is manifest in case after case with other sorts of social groupings. So it's easier to associate positive terms with slender people and negative terms with people who are overweight. It's easier to associate positive terms with heterosexuals and negative terms with homosexuals, and so on. And so this body of research has been taken to show that a particular set of associations is remarkably common among the late 20th century American populace.
And does this hold for members of the group that has the negative association as well?
One of the most striking things about the research is that although there are some differences between the races, it looks like even with respect to a group of which one's a member, people commonly encode the cultural associations, at least in the sense that they show these quicker reaction times. So members of the African American community frequently show reaction times similar to those of the white American community, and so on.
Right. Yeah, so that's very interesting. So can you put that in a larger context of the kinds of studies that show implicit associations in general?
So one of the interesting things is to ask, what does this speed of association do? What sort of manifestations does it have in terms of people's general judgments and behaviors? And there have been all sorts of striking studies showing correlations between the implicit associations that people have and their judgments in certain tasks. So, for example, one of the classic studies involves presenting people with one of a pair of otherwise identical resumes, one of which has a typically African name at the top, like LaShandra or Latoya or Jamil, and the other of which in always identical, has at the top a name that is culturally unmarked. And there's a tendency among almost all subjects to rate the candidate whose name is a typically African name as less qualified for the position, even though the resumes are otherwise identical.
Right, and this is true for people who deny that the races are different and think that people should be evaluated independently of race and that sort of thing. Yes.
This is true for people whose explicit avowals are completely racially unbiased. So there's a gap, it seems, between their explicit commitments and their implicit attitudes as activated by the presence of the name on this resume.
Right.
There are similar studies which are done showing, for example, that it is easier to perceive an object as a gun rather than a wallet if it's held by a man who appears to be of African descent than if it's held by a man who appears to be of European descent. That is, people are more likely to interpret an ambiguous object as a gun than as a wallet if its holder appears to be of African descent. Another example of the ways in which implicit associations may play a role in affecting perception and judgment.
And my understanding is that people don't have very good self-knowledge about whether they possess these associations or not.
No, one of the interesting things about implicit associations and implicit attitudes in general is that they are implicit, and though one may be aware of them, there's a perfectly reasonable likelihood that one isn't. And in fact, one of the things that people love to do after they hear about the IAT is to go and take some of these online studies at the IAT site, and in so doing, find themselves typically surprised by the results. Right.
So, since we're philosophers, it's nice to have a thought experiment in thought example in mind. So, one kind of case that to flesh it out a little bit, I've been thinking about in some of my research is a fictional woman I imagine who I call her Juliet. She's a philosophy professor. She explicitly disavows racism. She will say, for example, that all the races are intellectually equal. There's no intelligence differences between Asian people and black people and white people. In fact, she has excellent arguments for this. Maybe she has studied the empirical literature on this, and she finds it compelling and for good reason to think that all the races are intellectually equal. And yet, she shows a pattern of bias in her spontaneous thoughts and reactions, right? So, for example, she's a professor. She looks out on class the first day. Some people will strike her spontaneously as, oh, that person looks smart. Other people not so. And to her, say, the black people never strike her as looking smart. Or when a black student makes a smart, insightful comment, she'll be more surprised than she would be if a white student or an Asian student were to make that same comment. Or if she's evaluating someone for an office manager position, she'll require more evidence to be convinced of the intelligence of a black applicant than a white applicant, right? So kind of pervasively through her life, she seems to show actions and reactions that suggest, you might think from the outside, that she doesn't think that black people are as smart as white people. But if you ask her explicitly, she says, no, all the races are intellectually equal, and she says it sincerely, she's not lying. So that's a kind of to get a vivid example in mind. Let's imagine Juliet, say.
So Juliet is our philosophy professor whose explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes seem to come apart.
Right.
The attitudes to which she has reflective access are attitudes which are fully committed to anti-racism and racial equality, whereas her implicit attitudes as manifest in her patterns of behavior and perception appear not to support that.
Right. So one of the things we can think about, and one of the things that you and I have disagreed about to some extent, is whether we should say that in a case like Juliet's, that Juliet believes that all the races are intellectually equal. Now, my understanding is that you want to say that she does believe that her belief tracks her explicit avowals, and that she has this other attitude, aleaf, that is in tension with her explicit belief. Am I understanding correctly?
That's right, although it's not merely her explicit avowals that are sufficient for me to credit that with her belief. It's a richer set of reflective commitments that seem to me to be required. But I'm prepared to say that there's somebody who matches the description that you gave in the richer formulation of Juliet, who believes in the equality of races, despite the fact that the behavioral manifestations that you described seem to be in tension with that. And I'm happy to talk about why I think that is and why I think it's better to credit those reactions to a different attitude, an attitude that I call A-leaf.
Okay, yeah, so let's talk about that. Maybe you can lay out what you mean by A-leaf and how it contrasts with B-leaf.
Good. So one of the ways to start thinking about it is to recognize that there are lots of things which can interfere with the expression of a belief in behavior. So I can believe something, but I can be distracted, or I can be tired, or I can be hungry, or there can be background noise, or I can be inattentive, and all of those things can cause my belief not to be the thing that guides my behavior. But in addition to there being these kinds of crude physiological things, like I can be hungry, I can be tired, I think there's also a level of cognitive processing that may interfere with my belief being what guides my behavior. And I like to call this intermediate level a level of A-leaf. So, for example, if I'm standing on a high glass surface above, say, the Grand Canyon or on a balcony, I might believe that I'm safe, but I might nonetheless show a whole bunch of behavioral responses of trembling that are clearly in tension with what one would expect from somebody who believed that the situation was safe and desired to be only in situations that are safe. And I want to say that what's going on in that case is that although I believe that I'm safe, I have a set of associations which are automatically activated by some features of the environment which lead me to tremble in that way. And I'm ready to say that the kind of thing that's going on in the implicit racism case and the kind of thing that's going on in the glass balcony case are sufficiently similar that it's useful to use the same terminology in making sense of them.
Mm-hmm. Right. So my view in contrast with that is so you want to say, okay, Juliet has one belief. She believes that the races are intellectually equal, but she has this A-leaf, and the content of the A-leaf is something like, what, black person stupid, don't pay attention to what...
The content of the A-leaf, I mean, what the A-leaf is a set of associations that get activated by a feature of her ambient environment that affect her perceptions and her filtering of information.
Right.
So one of the things that happens is that she's more attentive to errors and less attentive to correct answers. Or she comes in with an expectation that causes her to interpret information in a particular way. But crudely speaking, I don't think it's a bad paraphrase to say, look, she believes that the races are equal, but her A-leaf is as of the inequality of the races, and in fact as of the inferiority of the students that she has who are black.
Right. Yeah, I was trying to do it with your four-place
if you want to do it right. So in some writing, I've suggested that an A-leaf is helpfully characterized by having some sort of what I call presentational content, and then some affect, and then a behavioral repertoire that gets activated. So in this case, you might say she A-leaves black student, and then the affective content is somehow a kind of negative or aversive response. In some cases it's fear, in some cases it's disgust. These are sort of crude descriptions of what's going on, but at some level these are playing a role. And then the behavioral repertoire is one of, attend to negative features of the situation so as not to be harmed. So crudely, that's a way of putting it in the tri-place A-leaf.
Okay, and better than the horrible thing that I offered you.
There are lots of. I think contents are hard to pin down.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But one of the ways of pushing the line that I'm interested in is by saying the following. Look, if what were at issue was that she doesn't believe that the races are equal, then it ought to be possible to give her information that would cause her to change that belief. But in fact, Juliet is the Mary of anti-racist. She knows every single substantive fact that there is to be known about racial equality. She has lived in the colorblind room with respect to those domains. She spent her entire life in a space that's only red and green, right? So she knows all of the information about the races. There's nothing more that you could tell her. Nonetheless, it seems
So hold
to me
on just a second. Just to be clear, not everyone might be familiar with the example of Mary in the black and white room.
Thanks.
But yeah, so you're referring to a famous example by Frank Jackson of this woman who's completely informed of every fact about color, but from within a black and white room, right?
That's right.
And
So
then the question is, she goes out and sees red for the first time. Does she learn anything? Right. So you're imagining Juliet, and I'm totally happy with this, right, as being like Mary, and that maybe she knows every fact that there is to know about intellectual equality, and it all points in the same direction, say.
That's right. I mean, the Juliet as Mary was a bit of a sideline joke, and
yeah.
like all analogies should not be taken too literally.
Right.
But the point is, yes, I mean, it seems to me evidence in favor of the hypothesis that this isn't a belief deficit on Juliet's part is that there's no more information with which she could be provided about racial equality that would affect her behavior. And that tells me that her behavior is not indicative of her belief. Now, I know you want to say something different about the case. You want to say that this is an instance of what you would call in-between belief, that it's a case. And why don't you say a bit more about what you mean by in-between belief, and then a bit more about why you think that applies in this case.
Right. So the way that I would like to characterize the case of Juliet is that it's a bit of a false dichotomy to think that she either definitively believes or definitively fails to believe that the races are intellectually equal. Our language of belief ascription has in it assumptions about how our cognitive lives hang together, and so the language can kind of fall apart when people get cognitively mixed up, or when they have dispositions that kind of point in different directions. Right? So I like to think of belief as embodied in how we approach the world generally, right? Across a wide variety of behavior, a wide variety of spontaneous reactions and thoughts, our patterns of thinking, right? So if in general you're disposed to respond peevishly, say blacks are equally, right? And that manifests in your behavior and your speech consistently and in your spontaneous reactions and judgments, then we say that you believe that, right? But in other case, and if it hardly ever manifests, right, then we say you don't believe it. But there might be cases like Juliet's where she has some of the appropriate dispositions, right, her intellectual dispositions, broadly speaking, right? But other dispositions that don't accord with kind of the general dispositional structure, the stereotype that we would appropriately associate with believing that all the races are intellectually equal. So she's kind of an in-between case. It's like, let's say that there was someone who, in some respects, was very extroverted, in other respects, was very introverted or shy, right? It might not be right to say, that person is extroverted, simpliciter, or shy, simpliciter, right? The person is in between. It's not quite, a simple attribution isn't quite appropriate. So I guess I prefer that way of characterizing Juliet's case. It's not quite right to say that she believes all the races are intellectually equal. It's not quite right to say that she fails to believe that. You can have to step back from either of those attributions and say that she's in a mixed state, an in-between kind of state.
Good. I mean, I think what our discussion shows is that there's two really interesting things that it appears we want the notion of belief to do. And it's not clear that belief can do both of those things, given the kinds of beings we are. On the one hand, one of the things that you've stressed is the deep connection between belief and behavior. That is, it's an assumption that a belief of a particular kind and a desire of a particular kind will give rise to a predictable behavior, and that as a result you can read belief off of behavior. And so that's one strand in the picture that we have of belief, that beliefs reveal preferences, to put it in slogan form. On the other hand, there's a notion of belief, and one to which I think I'm more sympathetic, and that's a notion of belief which makes belief an attitude which is responsive to reasons and understanding. And it looks like if you stress the reasons and understanding notion of belief, then you get a different sort of account of what's going on in these admittedly non-paradigmatic cases. So I think both of us agree in cases where avowed attitudes and predicted behaviors go together, that we want to attribute beliefs. Then in cases where we have neither of them, we don't want to attribute beliefs. And that the debate has to do with what should happen when they come apart.
Right. But I want to stress that in the Juliet case, it's not just the behavior that comes apart, right? But it would also be her private reactions to individuals and her emotional responses that may not manifest in behavior.
Good. I guess I should be more clear about what it is that I mean by behavior in that context. We're embodied beings, and in some sense, speech is also behavior. Thought is also behavior. So it's a bit crude, you're right, to draw the line at the point where I have and say, look, a particular kind of behavior counts as one thing, whereas other kinds of behavior don't. The reason it doesn't seem quite so ad hoc to do it in that way is that I think there's been at least a 2,000-year philosophical tradition in Western philosophy of distinguishing between, roughly speaking, reflective and non-reflective attitudes. And I suppose what I mean when I say behavior is not so much behavior simpliciter, but non-reflective behavior, whereas what I mean by the other is roughly reflective behavior.
Right. I guess that gets to what seems to me the one of the main reasons that I'm uncomfortable with your account, right, is that you are latching on to this tradition that divides kind of the spontaneous, the emotional, the habitual from the the intellectual and the reasoned. And I feel like that's a bit of a false division, that really we reason partly through our emotions, that habits and associations are really a fundamental part of reasoning, that you can't that this divide is a little bit of a myth.
I agree with you that the picture that there's sort of part of us that's purely angel and part of us that's purely animal and nothing in between is a false way to understand the human mind. But I think it's a useful idealization for making sense of these kinds of cases, of which right now we have only two examples on the table. So we have on the table the example of Juliet, the person who is explicitly anti-racist and implicitly responds in racist ways, and we have the example of the person on the glass surface. But there's a cluster of other cases that you and I and others have been thinking about, and perhaps it's useful to bring some of those into the conversation as a way of suggesting why it is that each of us holds the position that we do. So your colleague Aaron Zimmerman has a nice series of cases which basically involve what I would call lagging habits. So you rearrange your kitchen, the wastebasket used to be on the left, now it's on the right. You walk into your kitchen, you say, it's so nice to have the wastebasket on the right, and you walk right over to where it used to be. You have a case of driving to work along a non-standard route that has that form. So that's another kind of case that we both like to discuss.
Right. So, so that's those kinds of cases, I think, too, are cases where So let's say we take the case of the person who uh, sometimes responds in a way that's it goes to the wastebasket case, right? The person goes to dispose of the waste where she used to have the wastebasket, Aaron Zimmerman's example of hope, right? Rather than where she kind of knows the wastebasket is, right? So he says clearly this person believes that the wastebasket is in the old place, and she just has this persisting habit. So
Sorry,
that's a good kind of case.
did you misspeak? I think clearly this person believes that the wastebasket is in the new place. She
Yes,
just
sorry.
has this lagging habit.
Sorry, I misspoke. Yeah, right. So, in a way, that's a complicated case for me. I'm not sure what I want to say exactly. It's going to depend on the details because if the disposition to dispose of the waste in the old place is really unconnected with anything else, it's kind of an outlier disposition, even though it's a really central one to the stereotype for believing it's there, then I think we might want to say, okay, overall, this person's dispositional alignment, right? If you look broadly at the person's thoughts and reactions and spontaneous behavior and thoughtful behavior, overall it points in this direction. But there's this one outlying disposition that is kind of explicable. Then we might say, well, the person believes, right? But if, for example, this person, when she's drawing new plans for how she wants to rearrange the kitchen, right, doesn't take into account the fact that the garbage can is moved, right? So now this disposition is connected not just to this one particular piece of stereotype behavior, right, but to other thoughts, then I think that starts to point toward it being more of an in-between case.
So you're inclined to allow for isolated dispositions that don't match up with the overall belief set.
Right.
But your picture is that if there start to be too many of those, you want to call it a case of in-between believing.
That's
Would
right.
you say a similar thing about what philosophers sometimes call the problem of fictional emotions? So I'm watching a sad movie and I cry, I'm watching a scary movie and I crouch, I'm watching a sports event and I scream at the television screen. In all three of
Right.
those cases, it seems to me odd to want to say that I'm in between believing. I
Right.
kind of believe that it's on the screen, but I kind of believe that it's coming towards me. How do you want to make sense of those cases?
Right. I'm not much inclined to say that the person, say, who sees the green slime on the screen, coming toward her, is an in-between state of believing. And the person doesn't think that the slime is really coming toward her. I think that would be a case where the person straightforwardly fails to believe, but there are some dispositions that don't line up with that are then excused from manifestation because my view is a little complicated in these kinds of cases because the ceteris paribus clause has been sprung by because all dispositions hold only kind of all else being equal or the conditions being right. Another kind of case is where someone's lying, right? So normally we'd say, well, part of the stereotypical disposition for believing that P is being disposed to say, yeah, P, when someone asks you, right? But if you're lying, you might say not P. Well, that would be a case where the assumptions inherent in that, the attribution of that disposition to the stereotype are not satisfied, and so the ceteris paribus clause is sprung.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So your inclination is to assimilate the fictional emotions case to the lagging habits case. Do you think that's also a case, the lagging habits case, where the ceteris paribus clause gets sprung, or do you want to give a different account there?
I think it can be. I think that depends on the details,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are two ways to, right. So I guess, so my picture of belief is that there's this stereotype of dispositions that would be associated with believing that P. And to to the extent you match that stereotype, it's appropriate to say that you believe the P. And if you completely fail to match that stereotype, it's appropriate to say you don't. And if you kind of somewhat match it, then you're in an in-between state. Now, there are two kinds of cases where we might want to just straightforwardly ascribe the person belief the P, even though she doesn't match some particular disposition in the stereotype. And one kind of case would be when it's just an outlying disposition and a person matches the stereotype well enough. We don't care about that one particular disposition, right? And the other kind of case would be where the ceteris paribus clause is sprung. The disposition doesn't apply because it's not really relevant. The disposition to say that P is not really relevant disposition when we're talking about a case where the person is motivated to lie, say.
Right, and I mean, certainly to put fiction and lying together has a grand philosophical precedent.
I didn't mean to be taking advantage of that in particular. And I should say that I haven't worked out my views on fiction in a lot of detail, so this is a pretty tentative reaction.
Right. I mean, I guess they seem to me to be interesting cases because, of course, my view is that if you need the machinery of something like what I would call a leaf to explain a bunch of undeniable phenomena already, then why not help yourself to it in the kinds of cases which I think are genuinely puzzling. And I think what's so interesting about the racism case is that that's, first of all, a real-world example. It's an example that matters. But it's also the one with the maximal degree of complexity. And so I think what both of us are trying to do is to build up from some of these easier cases, Grand Canyon cases, fictional emotions cases, lagging habits cases, all of which are cases that put pressure on the ways in which the two strategies that we adopt converge. They put pressure on those cases, and they force you to go one way or the other in dealing with these sorts of what you would call cases where our professed belief doesn't regulate our behavior.
Right. Well, I like those complex cases.
So
I mean, for me, actually, those are more of the starting point and motivating the in-between case, right? In-between account of believing, right? I mean, if you look at the kinds of cases that I've used, like the Juliet case, or like another case that I use to motivate the account is Geraldine, right? Who, behaves in some ways as though she recognizes that her son smokes marijuana, and behaves in other ways, as though she doesn't, right? Sometimes she accepts it, sometimes she denies it, right? She defends her son against her husband's accusations, but she confesses to the therapist, right? She might be completely mixed up about this, right? And I think those kinds of cases are fascinating because they break down our usual habit of yes or no. Right? The person believes or the person doesn't believe. It's this, kind of the fallacy of the simple question, right? It's just yes or no. I'm just asking a simple question. Yes, does Geraldine believe, or no, does she not? And I think that is a fallacy. I think that we should recognize that on any model of belief, but particularly I think on a dispositional approach, right, that there are going to be lots of cases where human cognition, things don't line up. So
I guess
you've got to recognize these vague in-betweenish kind of cases. And once you have that motivation, then why not think that the Juliet type case is among them? Especially since it seems to me like, why do we care about belief? Where we care about belief, why do philosophers talk about it so much? They talk about it a lot because beliefs, let's use an old metaphor from Frank Ramsey, right? Beliefs are the maps by which we steer through the world. Right?
So I guess that brings me to a question that I have about your view that I'm not sure I fully understand. So it's not as if the contents of beliefs are fixed and then we have to decide for a given P whether I believe it or not. So Juliet may, on your account, in between believe in the equality of the races. Presumably, on your view, there's something that she does believe. And I guess my question is, what is the content of the thing that she does believe? If on your view she doesn't believe in the equality of the races, she doesn't believe in the inequality of the races, she in between believes. The attitude she holds towards P and Q is one of in between belief. But presumably she, in addition to that, holds an attitude of belief towards something. What is it that she believes on your view?
I'm not. I'm. Yeah. I'm not sure that I accept that framing of the question. Right.
Aha,
So it's not. I don't think that there's a distinct attitude of in between believing.
I
Right.
see.
It's that I think that it's not quite right to say that she believes that the races are intellectually equal, and it's not quite right to say that she doesn't. It's a vague case. Like, I mean, there's not a state of being in between bald.
Right.
I mean, there
I
is
see.
in a
So your
way,
view
right? But it's
is,
not like a
I give
separate kind
you,
of hairstyle, right? You're kind of, well, it's not quite right to say that he's bald. It's not quite right to say that he's not, or tall, right? Um, it's not a separate ontological category. It's an in-between case in our
right, so
usual
I give
ontology,
you
yes.
some propositional content and you tell me what attitude Juliet holds towards it. And so I give you the propositional content, equality of the races, and you tell me the attitude she holds towards that isn't B and it isn't not B. It's this thing in between B and not B. But it doesn't follow from that that there's something with respect to the races that you want to say she believes. But why?
So, so you've got your knots in the wrong place.
Okay, so
The
I'm
scope of your
my
knots
scope
are
is my scope is probably wrong. Okay, so
so
it's not the case that she believes.
no.
Ah, it's the
Well,
case that she believes not. It's not the case that she doesn't believe that. Okay, why don't we let's get the
right.
scopes
So there
clean.
there are multiple knots here.
Okay,
All right. So let's take the belief that the races are intellectually equal.
good.
It's I want to say that she does not determinately believe that, but she also does not determinately fail to believe that, right? So I'm I'm
It's
not using
not the
two-valued
case
logic
that she
on this particular. I'm a
determinately
logical
believes.
pluralist, right? And I think
Okay,
that we can refrain. We don't have to say, it's determinately the case that she doesn't believe that the races are intellectually equal. We can say, eh, I, I, I don't want to talk that way either way.
we're neither here nor there on that. What I'm
Okay.
interested in is what is it that Juliet believes with respect to the races?
Um,
So I know what she
can you give me a
doesn't.
particular propositional content that you're curious about?
Yes. So does Juliet believe with respect to the races both that they are and that they are not intellectually equal?
Um,
Does she determinately believe that? It seems that she shows exactly the set of behaviors that you would expect from that on your view.
so, are you asking if I would attribute to her a contradictory belief,
Yeah,
or whether I
I
would
guess I'm asking, do you think she holds that contradictory belief?
No.
Okay. So
On my
you're
view, in fact, it's impossible to hold contradictory beliefs because you
because the
can't
disposition,
simultaneously
right, you can't
satisfy.
simultaneously fly and not fly at the same time,
Right.
you can't. So your picture is with respect to the domain of race, there's not a coherent enough lining up of dispositions on Juliet's part to say of her, using belief vocabulary, that there's a sort of broad scale proposition that she believes there.
Right, at least, if the candidate proposition is all the races are intellectually equal or
Yeah.
something like that, then I think if we're in careful mode, we should refrain from either attributing or denying that to her. Now, of course, I think there are contexts in which it would be okay to ascribe her the belief, and also other contexts where I think it would be okay to say that she doesn't believe it or even has the opposite belief, right?
Right. So, I mean, the first context would be I'm handing out information sheets about racial equality, and I only have 12, and there are 15 people in the room. And so you want to say to me, Juliet already believes this. Don't waste one
Right.
of your 12 copies on Juliet.
Right.
By contrast, I'm doing evaluations for the police force, and I'm looking for somebody who's going to be the judge, and I say, I need somebody who believes in racial equality to do these judgments for you. And you say to me, don't choose Juliet. She doesn't believe in racial equality.
Right.
Are
Or she
those-
doesn't. She right. Or I imagine kind of two black students who are talking about taking her course, right? And
Yes.
one says, "Well, she doesn't really think the black students are as smart as the white
Okay,
students."
but now you
That
switch
seems
from
completely
believe to
fair.
think. Why did you do that?
I mean, he could have said believe. I think is more idiomatic. Philosophers who use the word, when we use the term believe, we tend, I think, to mean what ordinary people tend to use the word think to mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the black students could say, well, she doesn't really believe
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that would be fair too. So, I mean, I think it's one feature of lots of in-between cases in the application of vague predicates that one or another, either attribution or denial can be appropriate depending on the context.
So one of the things that you remark brings me back to is where we were when I interrupted with my question about what she does believe, which is that you had started to say some interesting stuff about what you see as the cultural utility or value of speaking with belief talk about these cases. And I guess
Right.
that's part of my motivation for using A-leaf talk about these cases.
Right.
So one of the things that it seems to me that's really important is to be able to say to somebody who has sincerely and reflectively committed themselves to anti-racism that their beliefs are in fact what they take them to be. That it is true that they believe in the equality of the races, but that, like the Hope who has rearranged her kitchen, they have lagging habits which they disavow. And that those lagging habits, what I would call their A-leafs, cause them to apprehend the world in particular ways and cause them to manifest particular kinds of reactions. So it seems to me enormously liberating in helping people to understand how you go about bringing into line your reflective and your non-reflective responses, to give two different kinds of vocabulary. You give them belief vocabulary, and that's what you fix crudely with books. And you give them A-leaf vocabulary, and that's what you change with all sorts of other strategies that we have for bringing about change.
Right. So I feel the appeal of that. But I also think that this that simply to say, well, I guess you're not simply saying it, right? But to say that Juliet believes, right? Belief is this really important term in philosophy of mind, philosophy of action, epistemology, right? When you say Juliet believes in the intellectual equality of the races, you, as it were, trigger all the associations with these other areas in philosophy. You're implicitly suggesting that we should treat the case of Juliet similarly to more canonical, typical cases of belief, right? And you're, I think, inviting people to a comfortable view of themselves that I would rather have us not be so comfortable
But
with,
you
right?
might think, look, the canonical cases of belief are the cases that I would say are cases where roughly your beliefs and your A-leafs align. So your canonical case, right? I believe that 2 and 2 is 4. My belief is on reflection that 2 things plus 2 things makes 4 things. In addition, I have these addition A-leafs, right? I have all of these habitual responses. Most of what I do when I do basic arithmetic happens at really fast processing speeds. And so we want to say that's a paradigmatic instance of belief. And it's a paradigmatic instance of belief, it seems to me, because my reflective commitments and my habitual responses are lined up. So it's fully compatible with what I'm saying about the utility of expressing attitudes using A-leaf talks, to say that in paradigmatic cases of belief has the form that you say it does. It's just that the reason I think it has the form that you say it does is because that's a case where the B-leafs and the A-leafs are in line.
Mm-hmm. Right. But so here's one way to think of it, right? So Juliet might think to herself, right? She gets all these. Maybe she knows about her implicit reactions, right? So she can say to herself, I believe that all the races are intellectually equal, right? I have the attitude that philosophers think is so important to epistemology and philosophy of action and philosophy of mind. Right? If beliefs are the maps by which we steer through the world, she can say, well, I've got the steering through the world as though the races are intellectually equal map, right? And she doesn't. She's not steering through the world that way.
Good. So, I mean, that brings out, I think, the thing that we were talking about probably 10 or 15 minutes ago, which is this tension in the picture of belief, the amount of work that belief is supposed to do in the philosophical worldview of which both of us are a part. And it seems to me that the picture of belief that can do that work is a picture that can do it only when beliefs and beliefs coincide.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that if belief is this incredibly rich thing that is basically belief with a concordant a-leaf, that of course she doesn't capital B believe in that sense.
Right.
I forgot to turn off my phone, so we'll hear a little song for a minute. But keep talking.
I don't hear it. Yeah, so I'll agree with you about that. What I would want to say, here's the language I would use for that. I would say that she judges and is disposed to judge that all the races are intellectually equal, right? So the kind of intellectual attitude that you're associating with belief, or that you're using belief to pick out, I would use judgment to pick out, and then reserve belief for this bigger, more all-encompassing thing, which I think is the more important thing, right? And because of how the big role that belief plays in philosophy, we want the most important thing to be the one that gets the label belief.
Good. I mean, at some level, we don't, I think, want to turn this into a terminological dispute. And so the question is there a useful category that's picked out by either this notion of what we'll call big B belief, or by the notion of the thinner notion of belief that I'm talking about? And then the question is, which of those two better fits long-term philosophical practice? And I think both of us are ready to concede that we can make sense of the other person's primary notion. That you can make sense of the thing that I'm calling belief and you're calling judgment, and I can make sense of the thing that you're calling belief and I'm calling belief with a leaf in concord with it.
Although I almost agree with that, but I do want to just reemphasize, because we didn't get into it very much, that one caveat is this, right? I think that you're drawing too sharp a distinction between the rational and the habitual and emotional, and that really those things are so tangled up that the way that you're characterizing it is I think partly substantively problematic for that reason. So it's not just kind of a terminological thing.
That's right. I mean, I do think that one of the things on which you've been pushing me throughout is this question of whether what I'm calling an idealization is in fact so misdescribing how it is that human beings form attitudes that it's not a useful idealization. That it's assume a can opener on a desert island, which isn't a helpful way to solve a problem.
Right.
And as I said, I mean, I think the fact that it makes sense to say, would it be useful to give me more information, is a way of getting at the non-arbitrariness of the line that I'm drawing.
Yeah. So I think it can be useful to give someone more information, even in the cases that you would want to call a-leaf.
Good. So why don't you give an example of that?
Right. So, So, in the implicit association tasks, right? If you provide people with exemplars beforehand, right, of counter-stereotypical people, they'll show lower levels of association,
course
right?
They will, but
right,
I don't
know you
think
know that.
those count as information. I think those count as things that affect a-leafs. So if I just give you the information, there are 27 Black Nobel Prize winners, and leave it at that, that's unlikely to permeate your attitude in the right kind of way. I need to show you images and have you vividly engage with them in a way that would activate what I would call the a-leaf system.
Well, I agree that that statement would be unlikely to have a long-term durable effect. Do you know if statements like that? I don't know the empirical evidence about that.
I actually don't. It suddenly made me
really.
It suddenly made me realize that that's actually a really interesting empirical question to ask. That is, whether abstract as opposed to concrete presentation of information subsequently pushes around IAT scores. And one of the things worth knowing for people is that you can temporarily change people's activation sets, roughly, so that if you show people video clips of Martin Luther King or even Olympic runners, you can change for the positive temporarily the associations that they have with the racial group. Interestingly, they go back to baseline pretty quickly, but I don't know whether that change can happen roughly through intellectual means alone, or whether it needs lower level mechanisms. And that seems like a really interesting empirical question.
I don't know that either. I don't know. I could see it going either way.
Yeah.
But and the kind of the flip side too is that even for our most intellectual, I mean, in a way, on my view, it's kind of amazing, right? So you tell me, John is now chair of the department, Georgia used to be, right? And all of a sudden, all these dispositions change as a result of this new information, right? But they don't change completely, right? I still find myself heading down to the chair's office to look for Georgia, and you would say that's a-leaf, right? But it seems to me like these things are all tangled up.
I agree that they're all tangled up. And yes, exactly, I would say that those are a-leaf, and cases of death are a similar one. Hume has this wonderful discussion where he says, the master has died and the servants believe it, but they nonetheless sort of have these lagging habits, as if, the non-servants make their changes suddenly and completely without these lagging a-leaves. But it seems to me that it's, in some sense, the phenomenon that fascinates both of us, how it is that a whole bunch of stuff can change incredibly quickly in response to the presentation of information, and a whole bunch of other stuff doesn't change. And whatever picture we're going to come up with of belief and its related attitudes needs to be one that takes seriously how frequently that happens.
Yes, no, I totally agree with that. But I do think that our dispositions to judge can change in a kind of associative, a-leafish ways, right? And our associations, our spontaneous responses, can also change in swift, give me information ways, right? So if I learn suddenly that LOL abbreviates laughing out loud instead of lots of love, right? I might have very swift, spontaneous changes in my reactions to certain emails, say, or something like that, right?
Right.
So I guess I don't disagree with that you can idealize the cases these ways, but I guess I worry that the things are so tangled together, and so much of our rational thought, or what we think of as our rational thought, and our judgments and our dispositions to judge, they're so tangled up with associations and habits that it's maybe too artificial, misleadingly artificial, to kind of say, okay, A-leaf here, B-leaf here, this is association and spontaneous, right? This is rational and information-driven, right? That, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think we probably ought to start tying things up, and maybe we should just say a few words about sort of where we feel like we've gotten in the conversation. So, I feel like I've understood much better what it is that you mean by in between believing, and it was very helpful for me to get the scope right on it. So I assumed that for any proposition, I had assumed that it was reasonable for me to ask of an in-between believers with respect to a particular propositional category what it was that she believed in that domain. So it's very helpful for me to hear that, no, you mean this about in-between belief. It's not determinately the case that she has a belief with respect to that domain, because there's a kind of cluster of behaviors that one would expect, and if she doesn't have a homogeneous enough set of behaviors, then we're not in a position to attribute to her a belief in that domain at all. So that's very, very helpful for me to learn from you.
Yeah.
And I think, as I said, the thing that we both agree about is that any adequate theory of belief is going to need to take seriously these kinds of perplexing cases that both of us had tried to provide
Right.
theoretical accounts
Right.
of.
Yeah, that's a good summary. That's a good summary. And I do think that the A-leaf category uh, works very nicely for the cases that you start off emphasizing in some of your work, like the Grand Canyon case,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think it is very nice to have a category for talking about things like that. Um, so, yeah, I do find that in some ways a helpful distinction, even though I was emphasizing near the end ways in which I think it might be unhelpful too.
And I guess I want to concede to you that it's a helpful distinction only if we make a particular kind of idealization that both of us know as a result of our reading of the empirical psychological literature to be a false one.
Right.
That there's all sorts of top-down influences on lower-level processes, and there's
Right.
all sorts of bottom-up influences on higher-level processes.
Right.
And that the picture that I'm presenting, making use of A-leaf, B-leaf, depends upon an idealization.
Right. Okay.
Good.
Yeah, that's good. That's
Good. So I feel like I've learned something. I hope our
Yeah.
audience has enjoyed the chance to listen to us. And
Yeah.
thanks to Philosophy TV for giving us a chance to do this.
Yes, thanks for chatting with me. It was great, and yeah, it's nice to kind of try to figure out where we disagree and exactly what our common ground is, and see if we can expand on that common ground. It's
That
great.
seems terrific. So good talking to you, Eric.
All right, good talking to you too. Bye.
Good. Bye bye.